So at the end of the hour, with your help, I hope we can achieve a lot of things. For the ornamental tree module, I would like to make sure that you know about apical dominance, what it is and how it works. Understand heading and thinning cuts, the two major types of cuts in pruning, and when to use each one. And the correct way to make a cut, both small and big. And then finally, how to shape or prune an ornamental tree. So the reason we prune with ornamental trees, two main ones. One is for beauty. After all, we grow something that's ornamental, so it's supposed to look nice. And the other one is for health. And the beauty should focus on enhancing the natural form of the tree. So in pruning, it is not a good idea to grow a big wide tree and then use pruning to try to make it a small skinny one. Okay, that would be inappropriate torture. But something that we tend not to think about is pruning really is a tool for helping us ensure, especially in the younger tree in its developmental phases, to grow a very strong framework, especially in the branching pattern, distribution, and angle of attachment to the trunk. And I'll talk a little bit more about it. And all of us already know pruning is the main way for us to remove what's dead, disease, damaged in order to prevent the problem from spreading. So what do I mean when I say desired framework for a tree? If we look from the top down, the branches of the tree attaching to the central trunk should look something like spokes of a wheel. Should look like a wheel pattern. And that 360-degree coverage helps the tree to look balanced, gives it maximum exposure to sunlight and air. In addition, if we look at it from the side, the point of attachment of the branches to the trunk should have a minimum distance, vertical distance, of roughly 8 inches and preferably bigger, depending on the type of tree and the mature size. Now, these may sound like somewhat rigid, silly rules, but the reason is because if the branches are too close together vertically, they are going to shade each other out. So we're going to have parts of the tree that are destined to be unhealthy and create problems down the road. So now that we know this, there is something else that we need to know and watch out for as well, and use pruning as a corrective tool. And that is the branch angle, where the stem comes in to the trunk. The attachment should be ideally 45 to 60 degrees, a relatively wide angle. If they're too close, as in the illustration on the right-hand side, what happens is the bark of these adjoining stems will continue to grow and will be compressed in between in that crotch and creating a very weak attachment. Trees with weak attachment, like in this Japanese maple, it's a coral bark maple. Can you see the bark pressed in the center? They are more vulnerable to damage when we have strong wind, ice storm, adding more weight to the branch tips. And with problems like this, in the big tree, it's really not feasible to try to correct through pruning. You may be able to correct it when it's very young. It should have been corrected in the nursery before you bought that plant. So now that you know, if you buy a new tree, always check the branch angles. Now that we know what pruning can do in helping us create a useful framework in trees, let's look at the two major types of cuts. One is called heading cut and the other thinning cut. Heading cut, basically look at a branch and remove a portion of it. Doesn't matter how big a portion. It could be just the tip or lower down, any part of it. And a thinning cut, take a branch, you will cut it all the way to its point of origin. So it's the entire branch is gone. Thinning cut is the main tool we use in ornamental tree pruning because it gives us the result is a more open form. And heading cuts are used when we want to encourage a lot of bushy growth. And let me explain a little bit more. The reason why heading cuts encourages growth and make the plant bushier is because of something called apical dominance. It simply refers to the fact the tip of a branch produces a hormone called auxin. Auxin flows by gravity, and its only job is to prevent, suppress growth of buds down below. So where auxin goes, nobody else is going to develop. And when auxin eventually runs out, so it's too weak because of the distance it has to travel, then branching, the new growth, will begin. So knowing this is a very important principle to help us think about how to prune a tree. In the vertical branch, the effect of auxin is the strongest. So we'll have quite a distance from the tip to where side branches will be allowed to grow. But when the branch is at an angle, then the effect, the suppressing effect is lesser. And when it's practically horizontal, it doesn't do anything. That's why you see in plants, branches that are horizontal often has these vertical shoots come up, and people refer to water sprouts. Okay, it's because auxin is not allowed to do its job. So the time that we use heading cuts to achieve our objective is in shearing hedges, topiary, geometric shapes, because we are looking for a uniform surface and lots of growth. But most of the time, we're using thinning cuts in our ornamental plants. Okay. So the proper way to make a cut, if it's a small cut, we cut to an angle, 45 degrees roughly, and it should be pointed away from a bud. So the picture on the right is the best way to make the cut. And the three on the left are not good. One is cut too close to the new bud. One is cut pointed to the bud, which means that moisture will accumulate on the new bud. And finally, the other one is cut too high. So we always, or generally, look for a new bud or a branch to cut to. And generally, if we want to open form after the pruning, we want to cut to a bud or a branch that is going outward, not growing toward the inside of the tree. And when we cut a large branch, always use the three-step cut. First, 6 to 12 inches away from the point of attachment, make an undercut. Then go out a little and make a complete cut, and that's B. So you remove the weight. And then finally, make the clean cut, that's C. And where to put that clean cut can be a challenge for gardeners because it is usually not a flush cut. It is usually a little farther out than we imagine. And that is because we want to make the cut in a way to preserve the branch collar. And this picture shows where the branch collar is. If you look at the left half of the picture, it shows the branch bark ridge, which is where the stem comes into the trunk, and as the bark continues to grow, the two sets of barks push against each other and forms that bark ridge. So that's very easy to find in practically any tree. So go home and take a look at your tree, find the branch bark ridge, then move toward the stem, not the trunk, and look for the branch collar. The collar could be a slightly swollen area as is shown in this picture, or it could be a form that looks like tree rings. At any rate, the collar is important because that is where substances that prevent rotting and helps the tree seal the wound is stored. If we keep the collar, make a good cut, as is shown in the right half of the picture, see the line that says yes? Could not make it clearer, huh? So don't cut into the collar. Instead, preserve the entire collar to make the cut. All right. Now, look carefully, think before cutting. Okay? If you need to, take some photos, look at it on the computer, take photos from different angles. Take your time to look at the form of the tree, the general shape, think about your pruning objectives and strategy. And in making that plan, consider what is the natural form and how can pruning help accentuate it? What are the highlights of this tree? Is it beautiful trunk with some special color, interesting feature, or is it the foliage or flowers? From what perspective would I be looking at the best features of the tree? How is the framework and the crotch angle? Don't forget that, because we tend to sometimes look at the aesthetics and forget about the structural, okay? So consider all of these before deciding how we might want to prune this tree. So I'm going to show you some examples and different approaches. So one possibility is in an ornamental tree, and you can see this is a maple, and maples tend to have included bark. Seeing the trunk down there, the points of attachment are too narrow. Okay. If you want to showcase the trunk of the tree, it's one approach, and underplant it so it has a lot of interest, then we would want to keep the trunk fairly clean, keep the canopy fairly high, and that's one way to do it. But with a tree like this, the golden moon maple, that has beautiful foliage. And so we may want to showcase the foliage color and not so much the branches, the trunk. And therefore you can see the leaves are allowed to stay pretty low instead of limbing it up into kind of an umbrella canopy. Although you can see that in the lower right-hand side, there are some leaves that are almost getting to the ground. So that's where we may want to use a thinning cut to lift it up a little bit so it's not dragging. Now this gardener chose to have a balance between the foliage and the trunk structure. And if we were to critique this pruning job here, you can see some of the very long whips in the right-hand side of the picture, in the middle, and then the upper left-hand corner. Can you see those long whips? A lot of the trees, especially in late summer, tend to develop these long whips. And it makes the form very eccentric. So what to do? Well, use thinning cut, pull out the long whip that bothers you, follow it back to wherever you want to make a cut, either to remove the whole thing, or if you need more foliage cover, like in the right middle part of this tree, I would like to have a little more leaves. It seems like there's some holes there. So I would probably make a heading cut there to encourage some branching and more foliage development to make it a little fuller. And the same principles we've talked about would also apply to a weeping form of a tree. And I should mention that we have a lot of short videos on the subject. Specifically, there is a 5-minute video on pruning a Japanese maple, not a weeping one, upright one, that you can find on the internet, or just go to our chapter website. You'll find links to it. In the weeping tree, we value branches that twist and turn, not straight. Okay, that's the aesthetic standard. So in order to get that twisting and turning, instead of pruning to an outside bud or a branch, often we're pruning to an inside bud or branch. So that's how you get a change of direction. Is that making sense? All right, great. So the timing, to wrap it up, any time is a good time to remove what's dead, diseased, damaged. Don't want to keep them on the tree longer than it needs to. During extreme cold or heat, don't prune, because pruning is a form of stress, and it simply creates more stress on the tree when it's already suffering from harsh environment. So you might have read about when you plant something, when you plant a tree, you're supposed to cut it back. No. The science now is do not, just leave it. So planting, transplanting, do not prune. And some of the trees tend to bleed in spring when they begin to grow. And here's a list of some examples. Some people say it's a problem, others say it's just unsightly but does not damage the plant. So it depends on what works for you. And no pruning late summer, early fall. That's because pruning stimulates growth, and new growth will be most vulnerable to winter cold. And finally, if you have something that's a flowering plant, do not prune it before flowering. That's it.